Good evening, everyone. It's good to see people back. So welcome back to Howard Thurman, Moral Anchor to the Civil Rights Movement. And today is class 3. Just going over the goals very quickly for anyone who today is their first day joining. They are to introduce Howard Thurman and place him in historical context, to illustrate his influence on the American Civil Rights Movement, and to highlight his impact on American Christianity. And today we will be focusing on that third goal of highlighting Thurman's impact on American Christianity. I think everyone is muted, but if you have a question at all, you can drop it in the chat and hopefully I will see it. So today's class objective, they are to understand Howard Thurman's leadership through the Fellowship Church, Boston University, and through his educational trust and legacy as cementing his role as moral anchor. And a moral anchor not simply to the civil rights movement, but to America. Then our second goal is to understand that Thurman's goal was to utilize the common American faith of Christianity to realize the fellowship of humanity, as Thurman believed that God, the Creator, intended, by providing a moral clarity for American Christians. So one of the things he wanted to do in that second goal, the same way that in class 1 and class 2, we saw that Thurman had developed this commitment to reforming and revising Christianity for Afro-America. Now he is intent on trying to bring some of the moral clarity that he has gained to American Christians in general. Thurman, as a little boy, met the God of nature, the God of creation on his own, but then he had early encounters with the church where he felt uncomfortable because he did not see the God of nature who he identified with in the behavior of people in the church and in organized Christianity. So Thurman wants to bring these two together, the God of creation into the church, into Christianity. And part of today's class objective is helping you understand the work that Thurman would do in order to achieve that. Also, the last thing I want to leave you with before we leave the class objectives is just to remind you, and again, this is, I think, from class 2, that as a very young seminary student, Thurman left the womb of Afro-America for the very first time. And when he did so, his magnetic field, according to him, radically and irreversibly was altered when he realized that his moral obligations were not limited to the oppressed, but that they must extend to all of humanity. However, over the years, as Thurman developed as a professional, pastor, and professor, he realized that racial segregation was a barrier to human fellowship. Thurman critiqued the fact that Americans gave homage to a God in church that could not be found in American society. Furthermore, Thurman charged that the church itself upheld the sin of racial segregation that stood as a barrier to true human fellowship among Americans. This was a sin against God, according to Thurman, and a sin by humans against one another. So we will be looking at the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, which was Thurman was running, but from 1944 to 1953, and then his years at Boston University from 1953 to 1965, and finally, hopefully our time will allow us a short epilogue where we look at Thurman after retirement, post his BU, the Howard Thurman Educational Trust from 1965 to 1981. And I just want to mention the term contagion. Contagion was a religious value or part of a religious value for Thurman. And he said, "This gives me no sense of urgency, but it does point up the fact that if my life is to be spent to the fullest advantage on behalf of what seems to me to be the great hope for mankind, it is important to work on its behalf where there is the maximum possibility of contagion." So Thurman moving into the Fellowship Church will represent him attempting to work where he believes there's the maximum possibility of contagion. So the Church of Fellowship for All Peoples. The Fellowship Church established the ability of African Americans to teach and to lead in an institutional setting that included European Americans. In 1944, this was path-breaking. It also, as we move through the narrative of Thurman and the Fellowship Church, I'd ask that you look at it through the lens of power and access rather than through the lens of integration and acceptance in order to understand the successes of the Fellowship Church. And finally, under Thurman's leadership, the Fellowship Church had a large national membership. So it was, in effect, at least for these years that we're looking at now, a movement as well as a local congregation. Thurman would retain leadership of the national movement and the fellowship, but once he left San Francisco, the Fellowship Church would eventually become just a local institution. So let's look at the genesis of the Fellowship Church. So we have the Sakai group, which was a group of young people dedicating their energies to interracial problems within San Francisco. And they were very loosely organized, largely female members, and they were all Gandhian Christians. So they were very much affected by Gandhi and his philosophies. In 1943, members of this group reached out to Alfred G. Fisk, who was a member of the Presbyterian Church and department chairman for psychology and philosophy at San Francisco State College. Fisk was immediately on board. The idea resounded with him, and the idea was it was pretty loose at this point. There was no real blueprint, except that it would be a church that was interracial. And being interracial, it would be co-pastored by a European American and an African American pastor. So Fisk immediately started a national search for an African American co-pastor. Because Fisk retained a full job at San Francisco State College, he was not dependent upon this position for a living, but the Presbyterian Church had only allotted a small amount of funds to cover this experiment. So Fisk was looking, as he told national leaders, both European American and African American, he was looking for a seminary student or divinity student who is not yet finished with theological school, perhaps a part-time student, because that was all that they could really afford at the time. So one of the people that he reaches out to is A.J. Must, who is the executive director for the Fellowship of Reconciliation from 1940 to 1953. And if that name doesn't seem familiar, that's okay, but we did discuss him in class 2, and A.J. Must and Howard Thurman were friends and colleagues based on their mutual belonging to the Fellowship of Reconciliation. A.J. Must immediately contacted a number of African Americans, including Charles S. Johnson, a sociologist at Fisk University, and of course, Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman was intrigued by the idea and immediately began putting his resources culling his resources and his network to look for a person to fill this position. Thurman initially recommended his friend, Herbert King, who I don't know if you remember, but he was a national secretary for the YMCA movement, and he had lost that position recently in a manner that troubled Thurman and other civil rights leaders because they felt that it was racially motivated. But either way, Thurman reached out to King and asked if he would be interested in co-pastoring. King was not interested, and he said he wasn't interested for several reasons. One, the job simply was not paying enough, and the second reason was because of the affiliation with not just the Presbyterian Church, but also the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Herbert King was not a pacifist and did not identify as one, and as such, he felt that he was not the right person for the job. So Fisk continues his search, and Fisk and Thurman begin a year-long period of correspondence during which it becomes increasingly clear to Fisk that Thurman is extremely committed to this idea. Fisk moves deliberately into cajoling Thurman to join the effort as co-pastor. And he admits that he is dreaming and being unrealistic and that he has no financial resources to provide adequately for a single and young seminary student, let alone a married man with daughters and tuitions to pay. Still, Fisk writes, quote, "But somehow I feel that miracles would happen with you here. Finances would come and a bigger building and a work which would be significant, not only here, but to the whole nation. Now, please write to me at once and disillusion me if you must. But if there is a chance for the miracle, do let me know how and when and under what arrangements. We are naturally very eager to go forward as soon as possible. But we are even more anxious to start on the best possible basis when we do start. Shall I say that the destiny of San Francisco hangs in your hands? No, that would be overly emotional. I must be realistic, but I hope for the best." So anyway, Fisk and Thurman would begin to plan together what would become the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. And here I have a quote from Thurman, printed in a publication that he would produce based on his correspondence with Fisk and detailing the genesis and the origin of the fellowship church called Footprints of a Dream. And Thurman said, as he considered this decision, "For here is revealed that a man's life becomes meaningful and whole to the degree that he is willing to stake everything on a conviction that what he does when he is most himself has the approval and the imprimatur of the highest." So I want to link back to Thurman's India trip now, and that Khyber Pass moment that again we discussed in class 2. So Thurman comes back from that, after that Khyber Pass moment, he comes back to North America, convinced that he has to sow the seeds of the spiritual philosophy of nonviolence throughout the country. And now he's realized that the time has come for a personal commitment and a greater level of sacrifice, applying what he knows, what he has learned, and what he believes God is calling him to personally in an experiment that challenges the segregation of Christian America and provides that maximum possibility for contagion. So Thurman's increasing dissatisfaction with African American Christians and the Christian church now leads him to search for ways to create what he calls revolutionary behavior among Christians and within the church. And to do so, initially he explored, and this is all while he's talking, corresponding with Fisk before, during, and but he's exploring the early interracial movement in America, particularly in Philadelphia, which is closest to him. But he's not satisfied with what he sees there. He becomes increasingly vocal in his condemnation of the church's commitment to a revolutionary ethic, but its reliance on less than revolutionary terms. And so Thurman at this point develops a goal of implementing the revolutionary ethic in a revolutionary way. And this is what will actually become the Fellowship Church. And then I want to talk about one more thing. There's Albert Cleage, who will eventually Fisk does get to come on for a very short time as an African-American pastor. Now, Cleage is coming from Chicago, and he will eventually leave because there's too much friction between his approach and Fisk's approach. And Cleage goes on to become one of the early proponents of Black nationalism. But at the time, he did serve as a co-pastor, and this is right before Howard Thurman comes on. And I want to Cleage, and I think this is one of the things, along with Fisk, that really encourages Thurman to think seriously, to contemplate seriously about whether or not this is the place for him to be. So Cleage basically charges that Christian language in America and language environment did not match up with Christian action and behavior. And again, this is very much in keeping with Howard's own evolving thought at the time. And I want to share one quote from Albert Cleage where he says, "Liberal Christians everywhere can no longer avoid their total responsibility to society by making pleasant and ineffective gestures in restricted and isolated areas of living. Instead, the Christian church must function in every area of life as a united liberal force, striking fearlessly out against all forms of oppression, bigotry, and inequality. Its friends are the friends of human freedom, no matter what the banner beneath which they march. And its foes are the oppressors of mankind, even though they march beneath the banner of Christ. So, Thurman has been crisscrossing the nation since he got back from India to speak on his developing, his emerging ideas on Christianity, the fellowship of humanity, the radical new interpretation of Jesus as an oppressed Palestinian Jew. I mean radical for mainstream rank and file Christians, not for the theologians in the top universities in the country and the world. But these are things that he has been committed to. And now you've got this call from Cleach saying that's not enough. There's this complacency and there is this disconnect between what liberal Christians are saying and what they are actually doing. And again, this does jive well with Thurman's own thoughts at the time. Other early predecessors to the Fellowship Church included the Tremont Temple in Boston during the 19th century and experiments in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and a few other remote scattered places in the United States. The Fellowship Church, however, would become one of the first self-consciously, deliberately cultivated multiracial congregations in American history. And so Thurman wrote to Fisk, we must keep in mind constantly that the kind of church that we are building has never been built in the United States before. We must not hamper the creative form that the Spirit of God may inspire by clinging to the patterns with which we are ordinarily familiar. And then finally, there was a 1944 publication of an essay entitled The White Problem that Thurman penned, even though he normally attempted to stay away from such overtly racially charged titles and writings. But Thurman wrote this essay in response to Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. And in it, in the essay, Thurman chastises what he calls a race pride and an arrogance, and he faults it with causing World War II and warns that it must be replaced with what he calls the will to brotherhood. And this is the mindset with which Thurman will actually move from Howard University to San Francisco. It seems to me to be the most significant step that institutional Christianity is taking in the direction of a really new order for America. And Thurman makes statements like this in writings and in letters to friends as he's pondering this decision and getting ready to move into the Fellowship Church, because at this point, he truly does believe that something on this level has to happen. And it's a sacrifice for the reasons that we mentioned before. There simply isn't the money. And Thurman has been in debt ever since the trip to India at Howard University. Not just the financial debt, but he has a health debt that he's continuously wearing down his own health because of his tireless work. And so he's not sure if it's the right move. And initially, his wife, Sue, does not want to leave Washington, D.C. to move to San Francisco. So this really will be a personal sacrifice and in some ways a professional sacrifice. And those who have mentored Thurman up to this stage, Betty Mays and Johnson and others, when they find out about this move, they really will be taken back. So this stage also represents another turning point in Thurman's life and the next biggest personal loss after the death of Katie Thurman and his first wife, and that is leaving Howard University. As Thurman continues to engage in what he calls soul searching that was necessary for him to find what the will of God is with reference to this major decision, he writes this to his friend and colleague, Dean of Chapel, Charles Gilkey at the University of Chicago. He also discusses his excitement about the church, and he's continuing to remember he's not just being cajoled into taking the position by Fisk, but he's actually actively involved in the planning and the naming and the programming and what this church should look like. And again, this is all limited to written correspondence, but he's beginning to realize, in addition to Fisk asking him directly to come and stating that it would be a miracle, that this is really the direction that God is calling him to. So as Fisk and Thurman continue to outline and the shape and the location and the vision and the name and the program for the church, Thurman begins to ask for and prepare for a year-long sabbatical from Howard University. At the end of the spring of 1944, Thurman, Sue, and the girls relocate from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And here's a picture of them in their new place in San Francisco. Between 1944 and 1946, Thurman lived in San Francisco while still retaining his position at Howard University and Rankin Chapel, and still traveling back and forth and all over as he continued to raise funds. He was never into raising funds or doing any of the administrative work. But again, the Fellowship Church represents something that is uniquely Thurman's, in that not so much that it was his initial idea, but it is the idea that he wants to stand on, the platform that he wants to stand on at this point in his career. However, after a year, the sabbatical extends to 2 years, and then Thurman is forced to make a decision that he does not really want to make, when President Mordecai Johnson makes it clear to Howard Thurman that he could not continue to serve both institutions. And according to Thurman, one of the visions emanating from his Khyber Pass experience was a clearer understanding that in America there existed, quote, a fundamental contradiction that lay like a malignant growth at the heart of the Christian movement, as it had expressed itself in our country, making the church one of the strongest bulwarks in American life, both defending and exemplifying racial prejudice and the discrimination resulting therein. So with a very heavy heart, Thurman sent his resignation letter to Johnson, noting as he did so, quote, with emotional lacerations and a deep sense of personal loss. The students and faculty are a part of the very fiber of my life. So now we get to the Fellowship Church. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is what the formal commitment was. So Thurman had helped to create a pledge, which was a formal commitment that members had to take. And I just want to show you very briefly 3 versions of the pledge as they developed between 1944, when Thurman came in as co-pastor with Alfred Fisk, and 1940, I think, 8, as they continue to work through. So Thurman worked to lay both an inter and intra-religious foundation, or at least opening or platform, for the Fellowship Church. While the church was open to interreligious cooperation and members and would continue to evolve in this direction, its own framework was and would always be decisively Christian. So what we have on the screen is the pledge, which reads, I desire to have a part in the unfolding of the idea of Christian fellowship through the union of men and women of varying national, cultural, and religious heritage in church communion, to seek a vital interpretation of the highest manifestation of God, Jesus Christ, in all my relationships. And that was the pledge in 1944. By 1945, the phrase idea of Christian fellowship had been replaced with understanding all men as sons of God. And the phrase Jesus Christ had been replaced with Jesus of Nazareth in all my relationships. So we can see how Thurman's own thinking on Jesus is working its way into the very foundations of this church. And then finally in 1948, it says, understanding all men as sons of God stays the same, but the phrase Jesus of Nazareth changes to Jesus of Nazareth and other great religious leaders. So again, here we can see that Thurman is constantly grappling with and wrestling with this need to expand the Christian platform, keeping it decisively Christian, but to expand it as far as possible to bring in as diverse a representation of humanity as he can find in the San Francisco area. And that is indeed a diverse community. So now we get to the growing edge. So Thurman's vision was for the church to be the growing edge of a radical implementation of the Christian ideal in human relations. And we'll unpack that and talk a little bit more about what that means. But first, I want to talk about some of the very immediate issues that Thurman had to deal with on the ground when he arrived in San Francisco in 1944. So the first issue was that of location. And the location of the church, Thurman insisted from the beginning that the church not be physically located in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. He wanted the church to be in a racially integrated neighborhood or a European American neighborhood, but not an African American neighborhood. And this is where it currently met before he arrived. It was in the Fillmore district. And the reason he was so opposed to this is he felt that if it stayed in an African American neighborhood, the church would eventually become a Black church. Also, he felt there would be some resistance by African American church leaders if he opened his church in the same neighborhood. Finally, also Thurman had, and on the screen here, we have a map that shows, I don't know how well you can see it, but it shows the different locations of the Fellowship Church. The first location is down at the bottom. The former Japanese American Presbyterian Church is where they were 1943 to 1944. And that is also, Japantown is also the African-American neighborhood, as Japanese Americans were arrested and rounded up and imprisoned under internment. The homes and neighborhoods that they left vacant were quickly being replaced by African-American migrants to the city. And so if you can see above that first home, that line where it says Japantown, everything over this would be the European American neighborhoods. And so it was located, it didn't move that much further away from the African American neighborhood, but the streets were clear demarcations between the African American and European American neighborhoods back then. And Thurman is successful in making sure that the church is on the other side of those lines. Finally, Thurman has aspirations for the church to become a movement with national reach and to be reproduced throughout the country. And he also has a problem with its association with the Presbyterian Church. As we mentioned earlier, the Presbyterian Church is putting up the money, and indeed that initial building is a Presbyterian church. It's the former Japanese American Presbyterian Church on Post Street. And Thurman doesn't want to be bound by the restrictions of the Presbyterian Church governance. And he didn't want he made the point that there was not, he said, no American Christian denomination had addressed segregation as a violation of God's intent in creating humanity or as a violation of the values taught by Christ Jesus. So those are two very important points for him. Now, the Presbyterian Church was very lenient. The only obligation that the Fellowship Church had was to keep Presbyterian officials informed about the church's progress through a monthly letter. And it did not require the Fellowship Church to identify as a Presbyterian church. So Thurman did see some utility in the connection of the church. For the first 2 years, he really didn't fight it because he regarded it as a bridge to organized Christianity. But still, Thurman and the Presbyterian Church each viewed the Fellowship Church through different lenses. So the Presbyterian Church felt that the Fellowship Church could serve the purpose of being their mission church, serving the needs of this onslaught of African-American migrants, both spiritually and the practical needs. Thurman did not want it to be about helping doing uplift work or serving the needs of African-American migrants. He felt that if the church became a mission church, it would again become a predominantly African-American church and not an interracial church. So Thurman has to wrestle and fight a great deal to keep this church and to help it to develop in a way that's aligned with his goals and his thinking, but he does do that. Eventually, also, he didn't want the church to be a charity case for wealthy European American Presbyterians, because he wrote that if that happened, quote, the crippling disease that has dogged the vitality and the health of the Christian enterprise would have overtaken us. The deadly disease of condescension. And Thurman cautioned, if a man can feel sorry for you, he can very easily absolve himself from dealing with you in any sense as an equal. So it's very, very important to Thurman that the church retain some type of independence from other denominations, especially denominations that had not talked about, that had not condoned segregation as ungodly and unchristian. And then also, he wanted it to be in an area that would be interracial. By 1945, this whole issue comes to a head, and Thurman puts it to a vote for all of the members that have actually taken the pledge, and the members agree unanimously that they will cut ties with the Presbyterian Church. And this is a scary moment for the new community because now they have no home. The building they were in, the church they were in was a Presbyterian church, and they have to seek another building. And this is when they actually find one, then a second home, and then finally the permanent homes, all located in interracial or European American neighborhoods in San Francisco. And then finally, the coverage in the press of the church was wide. The African American press, in particularly, of course, was very interested in the church, but the mainstream Christian press was also interested in it. And there's a 1951 article that was written by Harold Fay, editor of the Christian Century, where he basically applauded the church for what it was doing. He talked about how much San Francisco and America at large needed something like this. He talked about the greater symbolism and the symbolic victory that he saw. And then he applauded the church for being committed to interracial fellowship as opposed to fighting against segregation or other political issues. And I'll read to you a quote. He basically says, according to Fay, the fellowship church refused to magnify its most distinctive characteristic into its one reason for existence. The main quest is for spiritual illumination rather than to crusade against segregation or anything else. The church endeavored to magnify that of God in every man. So this is what Thurman's desires are for the church, and this is what he will work to mold it into. And we'll look at exactly what the church becomes in a few moments. But first, I want to take a time out from speaking, and allow you all to have a little bit of time to reflect on some of the issues that Thurman was thinking of and dealing with at this time. So the question for everyone, and if you can either put your answers in the chat, or if you don't feel comfortable sharing them publicly, now is the time to grab a pen and a piece of paper, because I would like everyone to participate in this exercise. And the question is it possible to Thurman articulated his vision for the fellowship church with the following question that he posed in a letter to his friend Paul Robeson, asking Robeson to give a benefit concert for the fellowship church. And the question was, is it possible to create an island of religious and racial community in a sea of religious and racial tension and animosity? So what I'd like you to do is take 5 minutes to replace racial in both phrases with an area of tension and animosity within your community or society, whether locally or nationally today. And if you get through that before 5 minutes are up, you can also think about what other kinds of differences might be explored in this way. So it's about 7:07. If you could take maybe the next 3 to 4 minutes to think about that, and then the last minute to just share some of your responses in the chat, or if you're not comfortable with doing that, at least write them down on a piece of paper next to you. Okay, so we need to move on. I can't see the chat right now, so I don't know if anyone has shared anything, but I will look at that later. Um, so now we come to the Fellowship Church in program and action, what it was actually doing. So Thurman described it as the movement of the Spirit of God, an interdenominational, interracial, and intercultural church. And he said, people are always trying to tie a label on me. I am nothing. I wish you might visit the church sometimes and have the sense of wholeness that comes from participating in the fellowship of God as a human spirit without age, sex, race, or denomination. There is something cleansing about ridding oneself of barriers that separate one from one's fellows. So I think this is really what Thurman is trying to do with the Fellowship Church, to have people come and rid themselves of the barriers that were so prominent in American culture and society. And we'll see the way that he works to implement this. The first thing he wants to do is create an authentic interracial institution through through intercultural education. So Thurman basically, with the Fellowship Church, he and Fisk would be pioneers of what we call multiculturalism in the United States a few decades ago. And he's also working on what would be a precursor to today's diversity training. San Francisco, just a little bit about it as a city. I'm sure most people are familiar with it, but even in the 1940s, it was uniquely situated for Thurman's experiment in that there was unparalleled racial and ethnic diversity in the city in comparison to other parts of the country. In the city, in the 1940s, the city boasted 63 national and cultural backgrounds, and this was a selling point that Thurman would have on pamphlets and brochures for the Fellowship Church during these years. For Thurman, the focus on the fellowship of humanity, the church needed to expand the definition of intercultural to represent a global array of ethnicities rather than the poorly contrived white-black dichotomy that reigns supreme in American culture. And again, San Francisco is uniquely positioned to do this with its rich diversity of ethnicities in the city. In 1946, Thurman delivered a sermon called The Apostles of Sensitiveness. And these are the people that he expects to actually emerge out of his congregation. The apostles of sensitiveness were those who eschewed chauvinism in any form. So religious, racial, national, gender, etc. But instead, they were people who worked to cultivate empathy and to root out bigotry in others. The sermon also urged a commitment to nonviolence as both a spiritual discipline and as a radical tool to combat segregation and inequality in America. So these are the sermons that Thurman's preaching, not just at the Fellowship Church, but as he travels, and we'll get a bit more into where he's traveling and what he's saying in a few slides. But the thing that I would like people to come away from this slide with is an understanding of what Thurman's goals were. He wanted to form a community where all of the individuals had a fellowship with one another in a way that was rare in America at that time, across ethnic and racial bounds, and to have close relationships. And then to have not just the individual relationships, but also the strength of corporate relationships in order to really rid themselves of these barriers that separated Americans from one another. So the church was also publicized as a place for seekers, as a church that was open to everyone, and a place where you could engage in serious and meaningful engagement of both spiritual and religious life. And I have on the screen right here 2 pictures. Again, multicultural or intercultural is something that Thurman and Fisk really worked to advertise the church as. And here in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see students. You have Filipino, Asian, European American, African Americans all working together. And there was a curriculum. And again, that curriculum would be kind of what we would call multicultural or diversity training today for the adults and multicultural education for the youth. And then there's another picture in the right-hand upper corner showing the youth also engaged in eating and breaking bread together. And again, in 1944, this is pretty, you couldn't go to, Alabama or Mississippi and do this. And so this was pretty radical. And this is what Thurman meant in the slides that we started out with at the beginning of this today, when he said he wanted radical and revolutionary behavior and ethic to match the revolutionary behavior and the revolutionary and radical language of the church. Now, another part of Thurman's program was dance. Well, actually, no, we don't have time for that. Thurman expanded his unique worship services from Rankin Chapel even further at the Fellowship Church. His worship dance services featured liturgical dance, and he created a liturgical dance choir to lead the dance services. Thurman was intent upon using dance to synthesize body, mind, and spirit. His dancers improvised, they used modern dance, they danced to Thurman reading from such sources as Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali, and they also danced to medieval music, to Renaissance music. They choreographed recreations of artistic drawings, of other dances, and even of opera. So Thurman was able to make use of his ethnically and racially diverse congregation to create dance and performances which were visually multicultural and therefore radical for American Christians to experience as part of their Sunday church services. Some of the brochures advertising a fellowship church talked about the young adult program. So an important part of the church was not just the sermons and the lectures that were open to all, whether you were a committed, pledged member of the community, but also the young adult programs, the adult programs, the summer camps, the summer schools. And then just to give you an example, there was one brochure where it featured a multicultural group, and then it's around a fire, and then it described the people in the group, and the wording under it said, the rays from the open fire reflected the faces of an East Indian, a Negro sailor from Chicago, a Nissy girl, a native San Francisco, a Filipino youth leader, and a Caucasian from the southern states, all in intense conversation, questioning dialogue, and opinions flying back and forth until the appearance of mugs of hot chocolate ended the intensity and discussion with group laughter, song, and fun. So Thurman was really working to, and I keep saying Thurman as opposed to Thurman and Fisk, because much of this is now being driven almost completely by Thurman. And for the time, Fisk is content to let Thurman run things. Fisk is increasingly being disillusioned with the church, not so much because of the radical nature of Thurman's interrelational and intercultural programs, but Fisk was a member of the Presbyterian Church and is rather unhappy that the Presbyterian Church is no longer affiliated with the organization. And eventually when he moves and leaves the church, it is because he feels that the church does not have the traditional Sunday school curriculum for his children. And so he parts ways in order to give his children the type of Protestant Presbyterian education that he wants. But back to Thurman. Other fellowship church projects included reintegrating Japanese Americans into San Francisco society. Some actually joined the church, such as John Yamashita, who was a second-generation Japanese American Methodist pastor. And during this time, Thurman continued his activity on behalf of African Americans who were discriminated. One example is when there were some African American workers who were being passed by at the bus stop every day because the bus driver refused to stop for them. They complained to Thurman, and Thurman eventually wrote a letter to the superintendent of transportation for the city of San Francisco, who immediately apologized, fired or reprimanded the bus driver, and ensured that these African-American workers were able to ride the bus every day. And these are the type of things that Thurman did that were in keeping with what he felt called to do. Again, I'm responding to scholars who would criticize Thurman as not being active enough on the front lines for the civil rights movement. Thurman stated, and here we have a picture of women, again, from across different ethnic and racial backgrounds, enjoying fellowship at a tea party, a tea event. And here, Thurman, I think this is from 1945, Thurman says, if in every community in the United States, an experiment such as ours would be undertaken, the church itself would once again set in motion those spiritual processes which gave to it its original impetus and power. So Thurman is establishing, implementing very radical programs here, and he has the people to do it and the will to do it, and then he's also gaining a national audience at the same time. So the Fellowship Church, if Thurman was before working at Morehouse and Spelman and Howard in largely African American organizations, but still speaking and lecturing here and there. Now he's gaining a different type of prominence and another platform. And indeed, this is the platform that will bring him to the attention of Boston University, where he'll move to next. But he's gaining supporters all across the country who continue to support the Fellowship Church financially and by reading the newsletter, which I think is called The Growing Edge, and inviting Thurman to speak at their institutions and organizations. But what doesn't happen is a replication of the Fellowship Church. We don't really see other churches quite like this popping up over the country. And to be fair, Thurman is clear that he doesn't want the Fellowship Church to become a new denomination or a chain of churches. He only wants the church to be a model for the unique flowering of other institutions locally that become interracial based on the people who live in those cities and towns. In 1947, the Unitarian minister Homer Jack will celebrate, quote, the emergence of the interracial church. Now, again, this doesn't really happen nationally. Most of these interracial churches that crop up are largely relegated to Northern California. But the founding of the Fellowship Church, for all of its lack of replication throughout the country, is significant merely because of its existence. It is still uncommon even today. Thurman was able to implement his unique vision and perspectives into the Fellowship Church with a more complete freedom than he had ever had at Howard University and that he wouldn't have at Boston University. On the other hand, Thurman's visions for the Fellowship Church, in spite of his accomplishments, would not ever be fully realized. When Thurman left for Boston University in 1953, the Fellowship Church was at its apex. So it would continue to exist even when he passed in 1981, and it's still around today. But in 1953, it was at its apex. It had reached the highest heights for where it would go as an institution. It would remain a moderately sized group with mainly middle-class members and with more European American members than African American members. The African American working class of San Francisco weren't involved in the church in any significant numbers. Without Thurman's leadership, the church would also not keep its national stature, and existing divisions within the congregation would continue to multiply after Thurman's departure. So before we leave the San Francisco, the last thing I want to do in this section is just once again show a map as we did in class 2. And if the map for class 2 was called Sowing the Seeds of the Spiritual Philosophy of Nonviolence throughout North America, this one is called Calling Americans to Spiritual Life. And I just want to remind you of the objectives for today's class. Thurman sought. In the second class, we saw how he, along with Benjamin Mays and Mordecai Johnson and others, were intent upon reforming Afro-American Christianity and cultivating a group of African-American religious intellectuals and ministers who had college degrees and divinity degrees, graduate degrees, and were fit to minister to the needs of African-Americans in the 20th century. Now he's also, remember, his magnetic field has expanded after his Rochester theological experience, and now he's committed to calling Americans to spiritual unity, but he must call them to moral clarity before he can do that. So We don't have time for me to give you all the institutions that he visited and every single state, but I do want to let you know, if you can look at the map, that during the fellowship church years from 1943 to 1949, Thurman continued to speak all over the country. He visited many of the United States' leading preparatory schools. He visited synagogues and churches, local and national conferences, civic organizations, including the Girl Scouts of America's Leadership Conference, and a host of other civic and religious organizations. He visited states across the country and Canada that also included Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, California, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Ohio, Georgia, Alabama, Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, Indiana, South Carolina, Arkansas, Vancouver, and other parts of Canada. So he's going all over these places and he's talking to folks about the need for moral clarity on what Christianity is and how to bring that radical ethic that is in Christianity, how to realize it in action. Thurman's topics included the meaning of brotherhood, what must I believe, the meaning of man's quest for religion, some important dilemmas of Jesus, the religion of Jesus and the disinherited, the genius of democracy, the religion of Jesus and man and moral struggle, saint and sinner, modern challenges to religion, secular radicalism, materialism, the tragic sense of life, better cooperation through interfaith, and as a visiting professor of religion at the University of Iowa, he also taught the course Mysticism and Ethics. And he also, interestingly enough, lectured on democracy as well. So in 1947, and you probably heard this in the names of some of the sermons and lectures and themes that Thurman was speaking on in the past 7 years, over the course of the past 7 years, he's talking a lot about Jesus. And we know that this is not the first time that this was a theme Thurman has been wrestling with since his days at Morehouse and Spelman, definitely through his trip to India, and of course at Howard. So in 1949, he publishes the book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Many of you in the audience may already be familiar with this. If you are not, I definitely encourage you to pick it up and read it, and maybe even to attend our program, book reading on Jesus and the Disinherited that will be offered next month with my colleague, Christine Krieger. But this book was considered by many to be Thurman's most significant work. He had been building these ideas in some in some form or fashion for the majority of his career. And in it, he argues that in order to understand the religion of Jesus, we have to first contextualize him as an oppressed Palestinian Jew without access to the privileges of Roman citizenry. And if you can think back, mentally recall those slides where I showed you the changing or evolving pledge for the Fellowship Church. Remember that he went from Jesus Christ to Jesus of Nazareth to Jesus of Nazareth and other great religious leaders. So Thurman is operating under this imaging of the prophets and the different religious leaders as all being involved in a fellowship of humanity and a fellowship of individuals calling people to God. The book also looks at fear, deception, and hate. And then Thurman offers love as a prescription for those who stand with their backs against the wall. And he reiterates that love is radical and that love is also nonviolent, and that love is the prescription which liberates both the oppressed and the oppressor. So Thurman scholars actually consider Jesus and the Disinherited as an analytical foundation for emerging criticisms of the iconography of a white Jesus Christ. The Jesus and Disinherited sums up Thurman's religious and political thinking and is considered by most to be among the most impressive array of his publications. I don't have a lot of time to get into Martin Luther King in this class, so I can take a few seconds to point out that King, well, he was at Boston University while Thurman was there, and he would actually be in Thurman's house at times, watching public television shows. He would never actually took classes from Thurman, but he was inspired by Thurman in other ways, especially through the publication of this book and through their friendship. And the two would write to each other and visit at least on one occasion. But King quotes King was often seen with a worn out copy and a worn out and very well read copy of Jesus and the Disinherited whenever he appeared for sermons, lectures, or speeches. He also quoted Thurman's story from his grandmother, where Nancy Ambrose repeated the slave preacher's closing at the end of his sermons, where he told them, "You are not niggers, you are not slaves, you are God's children." And according to King, this illustrated how being a child of God tends to stabilize the ego and bring new courage. And some Thurman scholars opine that one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s first exposures to the ideas of radical pacifism were from Jesus and the Disinherited. So now we come to the Marsh Chapel and the Boston University years, which were from 1953 to 1965. Now, because of his work at the Fellowship Church, Thurman now he's not just recognized as a leader among African Americans and African American Christians. He's no longer just recognized as a leader among European American Christians, but now Thurman is being recognized by Americans writ large. And again, that's one of the reasons why he will be offered the position at Boston University. And of course, he will become the first African American faculty at the school. Although Thurman received a lot of press coverage over the years, again, most of that was African American press or specifically Christian publications. Now we have, for the first time, he is being covered by just mainstream press, mainstream media, just on his own merit. So not because he's gone to India or he's done this, but because of who he is professionally and who he's evolved into as a pastor and a preacher. So the African American press, of course, applauds Thurman's appointment to Boston University, and even New York Times published a short article and a picture of Thurman. Jean Burden wrote a profile feature piece on Thurman in the Atlantic Monthly, where she called him a prophet who was among the champions of the disinherited and who stood for justice in an unjust society. So the work Thurman's done at the Fellowship Church, the work he's done crisscrossing the country to help bring moral clarity to American Christians, and the publication of Jesus and the Disinherited and its reception have really earned Thurman now a scene on the national scene. And of course, this didn't remain until the 21st century, but in the 1950s, people were beginning to know who Thurman was. And what we have on the screen is a profile picture from the April 1953 edition of Life magazine, which named Thurman as one of the 12 great preachers who were bringing America back to the churches. Other preachers included in this 12 great were Norman Vincent Peale, Fulton J. Sheen, and Billy Graham. Thurman was the only African American among them. And the caption underneath, I don't know, hopefully you can see his photo, and the caption underneath it says, Dr. Thurman, 54, pressed pants to get through to school. In 1944, he became pastor of the Fellowship Church in San Francisco, which, composed of whites, Negroes, and Orientals, was an experiment in, quote, total Christianity, end quote. Under Dr. Thurman, the experiment has been successful. He preaches to, not at, his audience, giving ideas to wrestle with, thoughts to meditate upon. This month, he accepted Boston University's offer to become a university preacher and professor in the School of Religion. So now, Thurman has emerged as an American religious leader. And if you remember back to his years at Rochester Theological School, he didn't want to be considered a Negro preacher or a Negro student or a Negro minister. He wanted to be considered a student or a preacher or minister. And Thurman at this point has now reached a point in his career where he really is on the scene as an American religious leader. His arrival at BU will become an expansion of the work that he has started with the Fellowship Church. In 1953, he accepts a formal appointment as the first tenured African American professor in the School of Theology and a dual appointment as Dean of Chapel, which was the same role position that he had at Howard University. He will also mentor leaders of Boston's African American religious, cultural, and educational institutions while he's in the city. And he's now on demand even though he was in demand before, he's now in demand on an unprecedented level, and requested by Boston University, and President Case, not just to minister to the campus, but to also reach out to expand the ministry to the surrounding communities of Boston University. President Case also emphasized in his bringing Thurman on, the same way that Johnson was attempting to recast Howard University as the capstone of Negro education, and Thurman was a critical part of that vision. President Case is bringing Thurman on as a critical part of his own vision to recast or revive what he calls the nearly moribund Marsh Chapel at Boston University. And according to a 1953 letter written by Thurman to the Board of Trustees of Fellowship Church, his new position at Boston University would allow him to do just that, and in doing so, to create a community that would be non-creedal, non-sectarian, interracial, interfaith, and interculturally religious in its fellowship. And I just want to point out, Boston University had started as a Methodist school, and it was now also part of President Case's vision that in the chapel would also draw in students of other faith and other denominations within Christianity, and that the theological school would as well. This did not have to be the case. Because you brought in someone to minister to the community, it did not mean that it would be non-credo, non-sectarian, and it definitely did not mean that it would be interracial. And of course, with Howard Thurman at the helm, he would strive to do just that. The other things that would happen during Thurman's tenure at Boston University that would help to expand his leadership as an American religious leader is that he will participate in a 15-minute segment every morning, initially on a radio show called We Believe, and then he would be doing the same show as part of a program broadcast on WHDH-TV, Channel 5, Boston. So basically, in addition to the immediate community of Boston University, the School of Theology, Marsh Chapel, and then the surrounding communities that would come and worship at Marsh Chapel, Thurman will also have a 15-minute section on both a radio and a television show where once a week, Americans in the greater Boston area and anywhere that can get this television station are also being able to listen to Thurman. And Thurman by doing this, he actually had over 150 letters and phone calls every week of people who supported his program and who were gaining or benefiting from it. And there's one quote from one caller, a viewer who wrote to Thurman, "Until I heard you today, I had never heard a Christian preacher who could be put on the same level of spiritual understanding as the great Swamis of India." So Thurman is indeed reaching many people and creating that credo, non-sectarian, interracial, interfaith, and intercultural religious program that he dreamed about. And he would be on this show for over 7.5 years. This is a picture of Thurman and Sue Bailey with President Harold Case and his wife at Boston University. And here's another quote from Thurman where he says, "Whenever man has the scent of the eternal unity in his spirit, He hunts for it in his home, in his work, among his friends, in his pleasures, and in all the levels of his function. It is my simple faith that this is the kind of universe that sustains this kind of adventure. And what we're fumbling towards now, tomorrow will be the way of life for everybody. So now we get to Thurman in the classroom. So the same way that Thurman developed a whole school or cadre of people who would go on to be leaders in the civil rights movement at Howard University, he's doing that same thing now, but mainly with non-African Americans or European Americans and others in the classroom at Boston University. Now, I don't have time to go into 2 or 3 examples, but I will give you one example of one student who really was influenced by him. But before we do that, I want to take the time out to try to give each of you a little bit of an experience of what it was like to be in Thurman's class. So in the classroom, students were guided by Thurman, and of course, his goal was attempting to help them clear away whatever may block our awareness of that which is God in us. So just as at the Fellowship Church, he wanted people to clear away the barriers so that they could experience true human fellowship, now in the classroom, he wants each student to be able to clear away whatever is in them that blocks their awareness of that which is God in them, or what God is calling them to be. And one of the ways that he does this is he establishes a laboratory session which runs from 6:30 to 8 a.m. And the other thing that he does is there's one main class that's a 2-semester class that he teaches for all 7 years, and that's called Spiritual Disciplines and Resources class. And this is his main course. He'll teach other courses, but this is a course that he teaches every year from 1953 to 1962, and it's a course that will be very instrumental for not only his students, but for students who will take the course as who will audit it as either consortium members or visiting students from Harvard Divinity School, Andover Theological, and other schools. So in the course, the first semester involves the study of religious experience, and he focuses, of course, on Christian traditional Christian traditions. They read Quakers, they read mysticism, they read Douglas Steere, existential Protestants like Soren Kierkegaard, Catholic mysticism like Evelyn Underhill and Simone Weil, and then also Zen Buddhism like D.T. Suzuki. The second semester of this 2-semester course was, according to Thurman, a study of suffering, tragedy, and love as the disciplines of the spirit through which an individual may be ushered into the presence of God. And then Thurman actually published a book in 1963 that was basically a result of this 2-semester course that he taught each year at Boston University, and of the accompanying laboratory sessions that went along with the with the course. And he dedicated that book called Disciplines of the Spirit to the students who took that course from 1953 to 1962. So now we have the instructions for your little window into Thurman's laboratory. And I have 2 requests, or 3 things that we're going to talk about. One, and these are all from Thurman, this is exactly what he would have his students do, but over a 90-minute window. He asked them, they were going to hear a reading, and it was him reading any reading. And in this case, it would be Psalm, I think, 139. And as you're listening to the reading, open your mind to the music of the words, to the general atmosphere which listening to the psalm generated in the mind, without paying attention to its meaning or ideas. And then after the psalm is read, we will listen to a musical selection, and this will be Kol Nidri, opera 47. And after that, or while that selection is playing, I'd like to ask you each to select a sentence, a phrase, a word, or an idea to which individual attention could be given for purposes of reflection, thought, meditation, or prayer, and to contemplate on that sentence or phrase or word that you have selected for 2 minutes. So Thurman would have everyone listen to the entire musical selection, the entirety of the Psalm 139, and then reflect for 40 minutes, and that was the entire laboratory. For our purposes of time, you will hear the psalm read, you will listen to 2 minutes of the musical selection, and then you will reflect for 2 minutes on a sentence, a word, or phrase which comes to mind from either the music or the reading of the psalm. And if I could have my volunteer, who's already indicated that she will read the psalm.
You have Psalm 139. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. And okay, so thank you. And then Thurman, so this is what Thurman students were doing from 6:30 until 8 in the laboratories. And then finally, Thurman would end the session with the final verse in the psalm as a benediction. Any wicked way in see if there be any wicked way in men, and lead me in the way everlasting. And that would end the class. So you get to see or experience just a tiny bit of what a laboratory was like with Thurman. And now I want to just move briefly. We only have 10 minutes left, so very briefly through the class, Thurman in the classroom and outside of it before getting to our epilogue. I will skim through a lot of this, but Thurman, he establishes a wider ministry. And I just want to say one thing. From 1962 to 1965, he relinquishes his official duties of teaching and also being dean of the chapel. And during that time, he focuses more on his wider ministry within the city of Boston and other places. And in 1965, he officially retires and will return to San Francisco. But until then, he is active in Boston and beyond. And I want to just mention one or two things about his wider ministry because I don't have time to get through the rest of the notes. One is a 1959 correspondence with a minister by the name of Monroe H. Fleming. Now, Fleming was a native of Mississippi, who worked at Hotel Utah in Salt Lake City, and he had promoted Marian Anderson, Paul Robeson, and other African American artists and musicians at the time. He converted to Mormonism in the 1950s, in the early 1950s, and in 1978, he became one of the first African Americans to enter the Mormon priesthood. In a 1957 letter, Fleming asked Thurman his opinion about the prohibition against African Americans entering the priesthood. Thurman responded to him, quote, "I have only this to say. If your statement is correct, it is from my point of view a device for justifying racial prejudice and is in violation of common sense, ethics, and religion. It is in the category of superstition and is unworthy of an intelligent mind." In a 1959 letter to Fleming, Thurman further elaborated on the idea of priesthood within Christianity. And Thurman's interpretation of the priesthood among Protestants was closely linked to his very own call and his own personal experience and answer into the ministry. He wrote to Fleming, "In Protestantism, the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers is based upon the idea that any individual who gives the nerve center of his consent to the will of God will share in the revelation of that will, not only for his life, but through his life, not merely for his words or his vocational function, but through his total life. This means that it is not necessary for a believer to go through some special office in order to get to God, but rather that God is as close as is the whisper in the heart. It is true that there is a religious vocation into which a person may enter that will give him a unique facility in administering through ritual and ceremony to the religious needs of the people. But this is a vocational function, and it is not any indication that those persons whose vocation this is not, but who are also believers, will be denied the wisdom and the guidance of the Spirit of God. So Fleming goes on to stick with his Mormonism, but he says that this later in life, he says that this actually gave him the impetus to behave as the minister that he felt God has called him to be. And of course, eventually the Mormon church would recognize him officially as a minister, but it was at least a decade, years after he had already started to act and live this way based on guidance that he credits to Thurman. So that's just one example of how Thurman affects others through his wider ministry. The television show that we mentioned a few slides ago was another. Thurman actually became a minor celebrity in Boston, in the greater Boston area, because of it, and he was recognized not only for the familiarity of his voice, but also the familiarity of his face. And it was often stopped in and around the city, Boston, Cambridge, on the train, in the train station, and beyond. And as I mentioned, he received a volume of at least 150, sometimes more, letters or calls a week. Thurman was also concerned about not having regular contact with African Americans students during the years that he taught at BU. So he would also from time to time take time out to embark on tours of HBCUs and to talk. During these tours, he wouldn't be giving a formal lecture, but he would be speaking rather informally with a group of students or student leaders or faculty and really talking to them about the merits of the discipline, the spiritual discipline of nonviolence. I would love to get more into how he did that exactly in times and places that impacted the civil rights movement, but we're running out of time, so I won't do that. I want to go into one of his, we had 3 examples of his teachers, of students. We had Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shlomi, as well as Walter Pank. But we only have time to go briefly into one. So I'd like to focus on Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shlomi, who lived from 1924 to 2014. He was the founder of the Jewish Renewal, or the Havurah movement. He was an innovator in ecumenical dialogue, and he was a prominent interreligious advocate in post-World War II American society. And of course, he would also become a student of Thurman's at Boston University. Rabbi Zalman was born in Poland. He was raised in Vienna. He was educated by his liberal father at both Zionist schools and an Orthodox yeshiva. He fled Nazi Europe in 1941 for the United States, where he was ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, and he worked as an Orthodox rabbi in Hasidic communities in Massachusetts and Connecticut. While he was serving an Orthodox Jewish community in New Bedford, he decided that he wanted the Hasidic community and culture wasn't enough for him. He wanted to expand a little bit more broadly. And so he was interested in taking a position as a Hillel professional on a college campus. But in order to do so, he had to earn a master's degree in a divinity school. So he enrolled in Boston University. Boston University was quite a drive. I think it was maybe 90 minutes from New Bedford. So when he arrived on campus each day, he had to actually do his morning prayers. He couldn't find a place to do his morning prayers. When he went to Marsh Chapel, there was too much Christian iconography, idols for him to worship. And so he moved down to the smaller chapel, and there he found a huge cross and crucifix that also on the altar in the small chapel that also prevented him from using it to do his morning prayers. So finally he found a small supply closet, and he would do his morning prayers there every day. And this is a story that Rabbi Zalman narrates himself. One day, a middle-aged African-American janitor came up to him as he was about to do his morning prayers and asked him, why don't you use our chapel, or at least the small chapel in Marsh Chapel? Because he was a caretaker of the chapel, Rabbi Zalman did not want to offend the man, so he just remained silent. The janitor went on to encourage him and say, if you come tomorrow morning to the small chapel, I think you'll find that you were able to do your prayers there. He was curious about this comment. So the next morning, Rabbi Zalman did go into the small chapel, and he saw that the large crucifix had been moved from the altar, and that 2 candles had been placed there in brass candle holders and lit. And that the Bible was open to a psalm, and it was Psalm 139. And the passage was the caretaker had chosen was, whither shall I fly from thy presence? To Zalman, according to him, this communicated that God, the omnipresent one, was available to him for worship, even in this foreign house of worship. So he went on to enroll. He was enrolled in the School of Theology, but at the same time, after having that experience with the chapel, he realized that one of the courses that he had enrolled in, which was a 2-semester course called Spiritual Disciplines and Resources, he needed to withdraw from, because on second thought, he was having second thoughts, and he didn't think that he could possibly benefit as a Jew in taking a course from a Protestant teaching at a Methodist university on spiritual resources. So he went to the professor's office in an attempt to withdraw from the course. And to his embarrassment, he found that the janitor there was actually the dean of the chapel, none other than the Reverend Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman talked to him about, he mentioned to him why he wanted to withdraw. And according to Reb Zalman, Thurman put down his coffee mug, and his graceful hands flew back and forth as though mirroring my dilemma. Finally, Howard Thurman looked right at me and said, don't you believe in the Ruach HaKodesh, or the Holy Spirit? So Reb Zalman was surprised and speechless. He said he left Thurman's office without making another comment, and that he continued to reflect on that for the next 3 weeks. Needless to say, he did enroll in the class, and it became one of the more defining or important classes to him. And he formed a friendship and a relationship with Thurman that would last throughout the duration of Thurman's life. According to Rabbi Zalman, he said Judaism and all other Western religions are suffering from having become over-verbalized and under-experienced. And he credited Thurman with giving him that type of experience that he was seeking. That experience that we had with Psalm 139 and the meditation and the music, this was one that Rabbi Zalman himself undertook, went through. And in his words, he felt that actual laboratory, which he did on a weekly basis, but that we just had a small glimpse of, was designed by Thurman to translate an experience of one sense to another. We would read a psalm several times, listen to a beautiful meditative composition in order to hear the psalm's meanings in the sound of the music. In this way, we refined and became better able to experience the divine around us. So I don't have time to go into much more of what Rabbi Zellman got from him, but Zellman, along with Martin Luther King, along with Walter Pank, who was instrumental in a movement to explore the intersection between medicine and religion, all three of these men were each leaders, were each directly or indirectly affected by Thurman, and they were each leaders of cultural revolutions during the 1950s and the 1960s in America. Martin Luther King in the Cultural Rights Movement, Rabbi Zellman in the Jewish Renewal Movement, and Walter Pankey in the movement exploring the intersection between medicine, drugs, and religion. According to Thurman scholar Peter Eisenstadt, each of these leaders interpreted their task as a spiritual discipline, and each was mentored and guided by Thurman during towards his path. Our epilogue, it's literally after 8 o'clock. I guess I will not give you the entire epilogue. I'll just let you know that Thurman continued after retiring from Boston University. He continued to do the work that he felt that he was being called to do, to bring moral clarity to Christians in America, to help to combat segregation and anything that stood as a barrier between Americans being able to experience human fellowship the way that he believed God had intended it. Many of the formal efforts that the trust began were dissolved or discontinued and do not exist until today, but some of them did. The listening rooms cropped up all around the country and were instrumental in bringing Thurman's voice to others, not just after Thurman's life, but while he was still living. And many of the other efforts can be seen in the work of those that Thurman influenced, in the growth of the Thurman Center at Boston University, in New Birth Corporation, and its preservation of Howard Thurman's historical home, in the Thurman Obelisk and the memorial at Morehouse College, in the development and significance of the Howard Thurman Papers, in the reception of the Backs Against the Wall, which is the Howard Thurman story that PBS aired, and that I encourage you to see if you have not already, and in the continuing, ongoing, and current outpouring of Thurman scholarship. Of course, Thurman's role in providing moral leadership to the civil rights movement and to the effort to reform Christianity in general is still understudied and underrealized by many Americans. So I encourage you, this class could only give you a very little bit, but I encourage each of you on your own, if you're not already familiar with Thurman, to use this as a springboard to become more acquainted with his works and his readings. And I guess I would just close with a point that Lerone Bennett, who was the editor of Ebony magazine and a significant African-American activist in his own right, when he was one of the people who eulogized Howard Thurman, and he said, for those who perceive the void in busy nothingness, they found in Howard Thurman the inner resources for the spirit in a homegrown product, nurtured and honed to a fine edge, not by a mystic from the East, but by a grandson of slaves, one who came out of the Black religious tradition with a message of hope and optimism for all men and women. Thurman took the particular of African-American religion and put it into a universal and global context. He wrestled with the tragic flaws of oppression and racism embedded in American Christianity and pointed to the religion of Jesus as an alternative. In doing so, Howard Thurman offered a renewal of Christianity and a spiritually infused alternative for seeking God and for cultivating universal fellowship. I'd like to leave you. You are all welcome to unmute yourself at this time. I'd like to leave you with a quote of Thurman's from Jesus and the Dispossessed. What then is the word of the religion of Jesus to those who stand with their backs against the wall? There must be the clearest possible anatomy of the issues facing them. They must recognize fear, deception, hatred, each for what it is. Once having done this, they must learn how to destroy these or to render themselves immune to their domination. In so great an undertaking, it will become increasingly clear that the contradictions of life are not ultimate. The disinherited will know for themselves that there is a spirit at work in life and in the hearts of men, which is committed to overcoming the world. It is universal, knowing no age, no race, no culture, and no condition of man. For the privileged and the underprivileged alike, if the individual puts at the disposal of the spirit the needful dedication and discipline, he can live effectively in the chaos of the present, the high density of a son of God. I think there might be a typo in that. Anyway, the last thing I want to pull your attention to, and again, if there are anyone has questions, they can drop them into the chat before I close out for good, or unmute themselves and stay on, is the upcoming events that we have at ICJS. We have one event, the Interreligious Lessons from Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, and that's a book series that will meet on November 1st, November 8th, and November 15th from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. at the Howard Thurman Library. And then we also have the ongoing Clergy Book Club that has already met twice, and we'll have one more meeting on Monday, October 23rd. And that's free if you register today. And then finally, next week on Monday, October 23rd, we have our Mannequin Clark annual lecture. And I'm pleased to let you know that this year we have Dr. Walter Earl Fluker, who is the senior editor for the Howard Washington Thurman papers that I have used and relied upon tremendously to put together this mini course. And he is one of the senior scholars in the country on Howard Thurman. And he will be presenting a talk called Wake Up Running, which is a vision for connection and transformation. And Thurman, Fluker, in addition to knowing Thurman and having a chance to talk with him and learn with him and be mentored by him, as I mentioned, is a scholar, worked for a long time at Boston University's Thurman Center there, and has been immersed in all of his papers far beyond what is published. So I really do encourage you to come out to this event at Northside Baptist Church. We also will have it live streamed, but I really encourage as many of you as possible to come and attend the event in person and show your support for this esteemed scholar who will be with us next week. And thank you. With that, I'd like to close and thank all of you for being here and listening so attentively. And I hope to see you again at any of our upcoming events, either virtually or in person. Thank you. Oh, also there will be a survey that will go around. So please do fill out the survey, because that's the only way that we can make these classes, these courses better for each of you.